Okay, wait a minute.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Moments with the Master. My name is Albert Dixon, and beside me is my good friend John Henry, and we are the host of this program. Our purpose is to glorify God in the things that we say and teach, and we invite you to open up your Bibles and to study along with us. And if you have any family or friends that might be interested in a program like this, invite them and let them know about this program so that they too can join in and study with us. Also, if at the end of the program you'll be provided an opportunity to have information to contact us, even know our location of where we preach, that you might come and visit with us, because we would love to get to meet you personally as we strive to obey and do the will of God. John, in our last class or session that we had in our discussion with Moments with the Master, we dealt with chapter 15, and we see God reassuring Abram. And also we see that the covenant that God makes with Abram. And now that brings us to chapter 16, as we'll further look at a few things with both Abram and Sarai at this time, until her name is changed to Sarah and Abram is changed to Abraham. But in chapter 16, she too has some of the same challenges as Abram had, in that they have left their kinsmen, and they're in a land where God has shown them, and God has made promises, and especially the seed promise of giving them an heir, and that hasn't happened yet. And so you got about 10 years that have gone by, John?
I believe so, yes.
And as we talk about this, we can also see and learn what faith is all about in our relationship with God. All right.
Yeah, like we said, about 10 years have gone by, and here's Abraham with no child. So that would make anybody, I think, begin to wonder, when is God going to fulfill this promise? Or is it going to happen? And then, that's like you said, when I said now, Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold now, the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. And Sarai, Abraham's wife, took Hagar, her maid, and the Egyptian. And Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abraham to be his wife. And he went in unto Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. Well, just looking at the first 5 verses of this particular chapter, like you said, here's Sarai or Sarah, and it goes back to this promise. 10 years have passed, there's no child. And so she decides that she's going to help God, you might say.
Right.
And it's never a good idea to try to help God. And we talked about that last week, about having patience, because, God doesn't work on our time frame, so to speak. God is eternal in nature. He's not limited to time like we are. That's for our benefit when God did that. And so she tells Abraham, as we read there, why don't you take my handmaid and sleep with her, and maybe that'll be the offspring. She bears a son. That'll be the offspring that we need to fulfill this promise that God had made to Abraham. And of course, by now, Abraham would have taken a time at some point, I would think, since Sarah was his wife, and she would have begun, thinking that something had to happen.
Right.
But I don't. But to take things into your own hands, that's just not right. You know.
Sometimes, John, we end up messing things up when we do that, as you're pointing out, because just as you're pointing out in this chapter, you could see later on it's going to create some problems. In fact, because Hagar conceives, Sarai treats her very harshly, in reference to that. And so again, you see this, it was her idea that Abram do this, and he did, and here she conceives, and yet not waiting for God to fulfill what he said he would do, shows again the impatience on her part, but it will always lead to all kinds of problems. Even though God works out something from that, it just created problems that wasn't needed. But again, in God's overall scheme and plan, you see how he, even in spite of ourselves, is going to accomplish what he has promised to accomplish.
But even though, this was Sarah's idea, and when this plan was put in motion, you see there towards the end of verse 5 or 4, that there was a lot of tension now between Sarah and Hagar, and and rightly so. I mean, there would probably be some jealousy on Sarah's part because she's not able to bear a child. Right. And God hadn't fulfilled the promise yet, and so she's taken it on herself to do all these things.
And the thing about it, John, Hagar ends up fleeing from the household.
Right.
And as she is fleeing from the presence of Sarai, she finally, the angel of the Lord comes and meets her, as verse 7 points out. Mm-hmm. And when the angel of the Lord comes, he asks this question as she is in the wilderness, and she's found by a spring of water there. And he says to her, where have you come from and where are you going? That's a very good question that causes sometimes we, even with Hagar's point, she's being treated harshly, and then she flees. And really think about it. Sometimes we have to kind of give some thoughts to where we're going and what we're doing, and that's exactly what happens here with this angel. And she retells what has transpired in her life. And notice in verse 9, it says, the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit yourself to her authority. And you start to think, what? She's treated me harshly.
Yeah.
And I've run away from her, and now you want me to go back to that and submit to her authority? That is very challenging. But John, that tells me something about Hagar, though, because she does return she does return back to her mistress Sarah, and she does submit herself to her authority.
Yeah, like you said, it teaches us something that evidently she knew enough of, or had been around Abraham and Sarah enough to know about the one true and living God.
Absolutely.
And what he required and demanded. And that was total obedience. And like you said, when the angel says to go back, she don't, like a lot of people might have questioned God, you want me to go back after I've been through all this? Mm-hmm. Why are you sending me back there, into this situation all over again? But she didn't say anything. Right. She didn't hesitate. When the angel told her what to do, she went. And that's a good point. And I think that, the verses after this maybe show two things. First of all, it was a child, it was an offspring of Abraham. And then also, I think not only Abraham's obedience, okay, but now let's look at Hagar.
Yes, right.
Okay, so Hagar obeyed, and so it only, stands to reason that because of her obedience, uh, later on we're going to see that, God says, I'm going to bless you.
That's right.
And so God blesses Hagar.
That's right. Yeah.
And why did he bless her? It was because of her faith too.
That's right.
Okay, now where did she see that faith?
Yeah.
She saw it in Abraham.
Right.
And Sarah also. And so, that's a beautiful picture there when you look at it. And she's going to be rewarded also because of her particular faith at that time. Now, go ahead.
I was going to say that sometimes, and that tells us about something. The things that God tells us to do, a lot of times, are not going to be easy, but we still have to trust Him because He is God. He knows what He's doing, and that's a matter of trust on our part in Him. You'll see individuals who did not do what God has told them as we unfold this plan that God has set in place to redeem mankind. We'll see throughout that historical background that there are some difficult things that God's people were instructed to do, and when they failed to do it, it led to all kinds of other problems in their lives. And even to the extent that they were drawn away from Him when they should have remained with Him. And so, again, that's another lesson about faith. It may seem difficult, but if we do what God says, it's going to work out the way He intends for it to work out. So again, the system of faith is already in place. We're just looking at it from this standpoint, and then we'll see its full blossom or bloom in Christ Jesus in the New Testament.
Yeah, well, I wanted to touch on this because when we go in chapter 16, when you get to verse 7, and the angel's talking, of course, she has not bore the son yet to Abraham. Right. And so that's one of the things the angel tells her. He said, you're a child, so you need to go back. But, as we've been talking about, she didn't question, why are you sending me back into all this stuff? And like we said, she was blessed because of her faith. And verse 10 points that out. It says, and the angel of the Lord said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, behold, thou art with child, thou shalt have a son, and shalt call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard of thy affliction. Mm-hmm. And so, God understood, what Hagar was going through and what Sarah was putting her through, this affliction. But He makes this promise because of her faith. Mm-hmm. And I find that, very, very interesting. Mm-hmm. And then he goes on and he tells about Ishmael's going to be a wild man, and his hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. He shall dwell in the presence of his brethren, and she called the name of the Lord that spake unto her, Thou, God, seest me. For she said, Have I also here looked after him, and seeth him, or seeth me? And so, and we know, we can tell by the definition of the name, he's going to be a wild man, a character, literally, among men as this happens. And so, he's going to be unrestrained. Mm-hmm. That's what a wild person is, I guess, or what, they get into everything. Mm-hmm. And so this is the kind of person that Ishmael's going to be. So, that's pointed out, along, even before he's born, his life is kind of laid out there by God.
Right.
That this is the way this boy's going to be, and this is what he's going to do in life, and he's going to become a very powerful man, it seems like, and all those who oppose them, he's going to be strong enough that it seems as though he'll be able to hold his own. It doesn't seem like anybody's going to be able to overpower him in that sense. And
another thing I noticed, John, when I look at and read this, for her to even go back was even for her own protection as well. To be out there on her own with a child, that puts her in a very dangerous situation. And so here is God's instruction for her to go back, puts her in a situation where she can be protected. Sometimes that we see we don't see the trouble that the harshness or trouble that we can get ourselves into, then going back and submitting and being treated harshly. That was nothing compared to what she might face out there in the wilderness with child, unprotected. So it's best to go back and be there. And then at the same time, and as the King James Version pointed out about her statement there in verse 13, you are a God who sees, or is me in the translation, but the idea that she recognized that God's kindness, she recognizes God's love for her, that God took the time to converse with her and give her the best instructions to help her to be able to continue on, and especially about the child that she was carrying.
And another interesting thing that towards the close here it points out now that Abraham is 86. That's 86 years old.
That's right. Yeah.
And still, there's no. He has no son.
Yeah.
And, that was according to the promise that God made to him when he was 70.
Yeah, and that's the key. Yeah, that's the key. That was the key there, John, that it was through Sarah that the baby, that Abraham was going to have an heir. Like chapter 16 pointed out, or chapter 15, pointed out, that God had to remind them, it's going to be through you, Abram, and Sarah. That's who it's going to be through. And you could see God meant what he said, regardless of the struggles that both of them had in this coming about and not being able to see that.
Yeah, there's, we learn from this, it's never good to meddle in, God's affairs. If God has said something, then he's definitely going to keep his promises. And so, another lesson from this is never take things into your own hands.
That's right.
It's best to leave things alone. God's going to do all that he said he's going to do. God doesn't need man, so to speak. I mean, he's the one that created us. We need him.
Right.
And we turn that around and think, well, God needs me to do this or do that. No. God, in studying the Old Testament, God needs us to simply listen to him very closely and then do what he has commanded us to do. And he'll take care of everything else.
That's right.
As long as we walk with him. And that's what you see here, I think, at the end of this chapter 16. But the Word of God does remind us that Abraham's 86 years old now,
right?
And so, and then of course we're going to go into chapter 17, and unless you have any.
Nope, that's it. Yeah, let's get into chapter 17, folks. When you get into chapter 17, again, towards the end of 16. he mentions he's 86. Now, chapter 17 begins in verse 1 saying that now he's 99. So 13 more years have passed here, and still there hasn't been the heir through Sarah whom God had promised would take place. So 13 years have passed. Now, look at this. Again, God reassures Abram about these things. In fact, as we will look at verses 1 through 5, let's read through there and notice what God says. I'm reading from the New American Standard. And it says, "Now when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless. I will establish my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly." And Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, "As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I will make you the father of a multitude of nations." So again, you see God reassuring Abram, as we said, 13 more years have passed. And again, here is God saying, I'm going to do what I promised. It's going to be on my timetable, not yours, Abram. And in fact, your name is going to be changed to Abraham. Now we start to see, and through all of this, that Abraham and Sarah, even though they had their challenges with this, that they're still hanging in there, and God reassuring them that he is going to fulfill it. And notice the covenant. God says, I've made a covenant with you. Now we get to learn even more about God. We know that he's a God who sees everyone and notices even me. That's one thing we see in these passages about God, that God is there, that God reassures us, and that God keeps his promises. And God, when he makes a covenant, we are guaranteed that God is going to fulfill his part. Now we must fulfill ours. And how do we do that? By being obedient to his will. And so God says, I'm going to bless you exceedingly in these verses here and thoughts that are expressed in these passages.
Yeah. And that's something that we see, from the time that Genesis 12, when God made the promises that, God's going to fulfill these promises, going to be in his own time. We just need to put our faith again and trust in God. Now, I hate to be reiterating everything, but it's important, I think, that we understand and try to get a hold of this, this idea of the faith that Abraham had, because so much of it is going to be reviewed, as we said last week, in the New Testament. And he renews the promises again. We see that he's renewing the promise here to Abraham, and then in verse 7 he says, he promises again, I'm going to establish that covenant with you. But Abraham's going to have to learn just to be a little bit patient, because he said, that is going to happen through your seed. As I promised you, will come someone who will be able to bless all the nations of the earth. And then he said, I will give unto thee and to thy seed after thee the land. So he goes back to those promises in Genesis 12, and he said, I'm still going to bless you with, more people than you can count. And he does that when they're down in Egypt. And then they come up out of Egypt. They're this great nation, a mighty nation, a powerful nation, because God is their God. And then after that, they're taken to Mount Sinai. The covenant is renewed there again. And then they're taken in later to the land of Canaan, and they possess it. And so we're going. We see then that God always keeps his promises. Because in verse 9, and God said unto Abraham, Thou shalt keep my covenant, therefore, thou and thy seed after thee in their generations. And so he's telling Abraham, it's important that they keep this. The covenant that God has made with them. And then in verse 10, this is my covenant which ye shall keep between me, you, and my seed after thee. Every man child among you shall be circumcised. Well, now we come to a point, Albert, where this is a very important part of the covenant that God was going to make with Abraham, this token of the covenant. Mm-hmm. Now, it's not a token of the Mosaical law.
Right.
But it's a token of this covenant that, these promises that God made with Abraham. And sometimes people, when they study and they look at this, even though the Jews had to practice this, right. but that token, the circumcision didn't apply to the law. It went all the way back before the law to Abraham. Right. And that circumcision was a reminder of the promises God made to Abraham. That's right. And so, of course, then he goes on, he talks about circumcision. And verse 12, he says, that he that is 8 days old shall be circumcised among you, every man-child in your generation, he that is born in the house or brought with money of any stranger which is not of thy seed. He that is born in thy house, and he that is bought with thy money, must needs be circumcised, and my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. Now, sometimes the word everlasting fools people. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because, we might use the word perpetual. And the idea is that as long as that covenant continues to exist, mm-hmm. then it's said to be eternal. It's just like, like when we look at the rainbow, God promised it. Well, it's not eternal in the sense that God's going to have the rainbow in heaven, I don't think. The idea is, as long as the world stands in that point, it's eternal that way. Right. And so this here is the same way, because in the New Testament, Paul makes the argument in Galatians and some other letters that what's important now is the circumcision of the heart.
That's right.
Not the circumcision of the male foreskin, but the circumcision of the heart. And so, there's going to be a play on this over in the New Testament also.
That's right.
About this idea of circumcision. And then in verse 14, he goes on and says, and the uncircumcised man, child, whose flesh of the foreskin is not circumcised, that soul shall be cut off from his people. He hath broken my covenant. Now, I wrote here as a side note when I'm studying, and I always tell people that sometimes the word cut off can mean like to be withdrawn from, have no fellowship with. Mm-hmm. But sometimes this word cut off means death, mm-hmm. and that's what it means here from what my study indicates when he says that soul shall be cut off. In other words, that soul is going to be put to death. At least that was what my study, what I found, might be wrong, but that's what I found. And the reason why he's going to be put to death is because he has broken my covenant. Mm-hmm. And so, God takes that pretty seriously. Maybe you'd like to jump in there and make some
one of the things I thought about that is, especially when you look in the New Testament and how it plays upon that thought there, especially in the book of Colossians with the circumcision not made with hands, And even with the idea of being baptized into Christ, there's a death that has taken place. And a circumcision takes place when the person is raised up out of the water. Therefore, they are now separated and they now belong to the Lord. So this idea of covenant and this covenant of circumcision, again, I believe we'll talk a little bit more about this as we get farther into this. But I think it's very well noted, John, that this takes place before the law is ever given to the children of Israel. Folks, time is up. So again, we invite you, and just thoroughly enjoyed being with you, but we invite you to come back again next Thursday at 7 p.m. where we will continue this discussion about God's plan being unfolded. But in the meantime, may God bless you in your studies in His Word.